camera that remembered. The morning mist clung to the Cascade Mountains like a shroud as investigative journalist David Harper climbed the treacherous slope toward the crash site. 40 years had passed since Flight 447 had vanished into these peaks, taking with it 37 souls, including his own parents, Thomas and Margaret Harper. For 4 decades, the wreckage had remained hidden beneath snow, ice, and the relentless passage of time. But climate change had finally revealed what the mountains had jealously guarded: twisted metal, scattered belongings, and secrets that some people had hoped would stay buried forever. David paused to catch his breath at 8,000 feet, his aging knees protesting the steep climb. At 55, he was past the age when scrambling up mountainsides should feel reasonable, but the phone call from the National Transportation Safety Board had changed everything. After 40 years of official silence, of unanswered questions and bureaucratic stonewalling, they had finally found the plane. More importantly, they had found something that might finally explain why Flight 447 had deviated so far from its planned route before disappearing into the wilderness. "Mr. Harper?" The voice belonged to NTSB investigator Sarah Chen, a small woman with determined eyes who had volunteered to escort him to the site. "We're almost there. I should warn you, after 40 years in the elements, there isn't much left that's recognizable." David nodded, his throat tight. He'd been 15 when his parents died, old enough to understand the finality of death, but too young to comprehend the questions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Thomas Harper had been a prominent attorney in Seattle, known for his work on environmental cases. Margaret had been a photographer for National Geographic, documenting the destruction of old-growth forests throughout the Pacific Northwest. They'd been flying to Sacramento for what Thomas had described as the most important case of my career, when their plane had simply vanished. The wreckage site sprawled across a rocky outcropping, pieces of metal scattered like broken toys. David recognized nothing. 40 years of weather had reduced the aircraft to unrecognizable fragments. But it was undeniably Flight 447. The tail number was still partially visible on a piece of fuselage that had come to rest against a boulder. "Most of the personal effects were destroyed," Chen explained, leading him carefully through the debris field. "But we found something remarkable." She stopped beside a metal case that looked like it had been designed to survive the apocalypse. "Your mother's camera equipment." The case was wedged under a section of wing, protected from the elements. The cameras inside were destroyed, but she opened the case carefully. The film canisters survived. David stared at the small metal cylinders, his hands trembling. His mother had been meticulous about her work, always carrying multiple rolls of film, always documenting everything she saw. If these canisters contained the last photographs she'd taken, they might finally answer the questions that had consumed him for 4 decades. "We've already had them processed," Chen continued. "There are some images you need to see." Back in Seattle, David sat in the NTSB's field office, staring at a collection of photographs spread across a conference table. Most were the kind of nature shots his mother had been famous for: towering trees, pristine wilderness, wildlife in their natural habitat. But the last roll of film told a different story entirely. The first unusual photograph showed his father in what appeared to be a heated argument with a man David didn't recognize. They were standing beside a small airplane, not Flight 447, but a private aircraft. The timestamp on the photograph indicated it had been taken just 2 days before the crash. "Do you know who this man is?" Chen asked, pointing to the stranger in the photograph. David studied the image. The man was tall and well-dressed, with the kind of confident posture that suggested authority. "I've never seen him before, but my father never mentioned meeting with anyone before that trip." The next photograph showed documents spread across a table. David's mother had apparently photographed them surreptitiously. The angle was awkward, as if she'd been trying to capture them without being noticed. Even blown up and enhanced, the text was difficult to read, but David could make out fragments: timber contracts, Senator Morrison, Cascade logging, and most disturbing of all, environmental impact falsified. "Your mother was documenting something," Chen observed. "Something she thought was important enough to risk photographing secretly." The final photographs were the most revealing. They showed a meeting in what appeared to be a private office, with several men gathered around a large map of the Cascade Mountains. David recognized his father, but the other faces were unfamiliar. On the map, large sections of forest were marked in red, with what looked like logging roads and clear-cut areas marked for future development. "This area," David said, pointing to the map in the photograph, "this is protected wilderness. It's been protected since the 1960s. "Not according to these documents," Chen replied, handing him enhanced copies of the paperwork his mother had photographed. "According to these contracts, Cascade Logging had permits to clear-cut over 10,000 acres of supposedly protected forest. The permits were signed by federal officials and backed by environmental impact studies that concluded the logging would actually benefit the ecosystem." David felt sick. "My father was an environmental lawyer. He would never have supported something like this." "No," Chen agreed, "but he might have been investigating it. Look at this." She handed him another photograph, one that showed his father holding up a document with a clear expression of shock and anger on his face. "This looks like a man who's just discovered something that horrified him." As David studied the photographs more carefully, a chilling possibility began to emerge. His parents hadn't been flying to Sacramento for a routine legal case. They'd been carrying evidence of a massive conspiracy to illegally log protected wilderness areas, a conspiracy that involved federal officials, private companies, and potentially even members of Congress. "We need to find out who these other men in the photographs are," David said. Chen nodded. "We're already working on that. But David, you need to understand. If your parents were killed to prevent them from exposing this conspiracy, then the people responsible are still out there. Some of them might still be alive, still in positions of power." David looked at the photographs again, seeing his parents in their final days, unknowingly documenting the evidence that would cost them their lives. "Then we need to finish what they started." The investigation that followed consumed the next 6 months of David's life. Using his skills as an investigative journalist and the resources of the Seattle Herald, where he'd worked for 25 years, he began to piece together the conspiracy his parents had died trying to expose. The man arguing with his father in the first photograph was identified as Robert Caldwell, who in 1983 had been a high-ranking official in the Department of the Interior. Caldwell had died in 2019, but David managed to track down his former secretary, now in her 80s and living in a nursing home in Spokane. "Mr. Caldwell was very nervous in the weeks before that plane crash," Eleanor Martinez told David during their interview. "He kept getting phone calls that made him angry, and he was working late every night, going through files and making copies of things. He told me once that he was trying to clean up a mess before it exploded." "Do you remember anything specific about those files?" Eleanor's eyes grew distant. "Logging permits. Lots of logging permits for areas that were supposed to be protected. And there was something about Senator Morrison. He and Mr. Caldwell had several heated phone conversations about those permits. Senator Morrison." David's blood ran cold. Senator Richard Morrison had been a powerful figure in Washington for over 3 decades, serving on the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. He'd built his reputation as a champion of conservation, but if Eleanor was right, he'd been secretly approving the destruction of the very lands he claimed to protect. Morrison was still alive, now 87 and long retired from the Senate, but in 1983 he'd been at the height of his power, with the influence to make environmental regulations disappear and to ensure that troublesome lawyers asking inconvenient questions might face unfortunate accidents. David's investigation revealed a pattern that stretched back decades. Cascade Logging had been systematically bribing federal officials to gain access to protected wilderness areas. The environmental impact studies that justified the logging had been falsified, the true ecological damage hidden from the public. Millions of acres of irreplaceable forest had been destroyed, all while Senator Morrison had publicly championed environmental protection. But the conspiracy had begun to unravel in 1983. Thomas Harper had been hired by a coalition of environmental groups to investigate rumors of illegal logging in the Cascades. His investigation had uncovered the falsified permits and the bribery scheme. Meanwhile, Margaret Harper had been documenting the ecological damage for a National Geographic story that would have exposed the conspiracy to millions of readers worldwide. The couple had arranged to meet with federal investigators in Sacramento, carrying with them photographs, documents, and testimony that would have brought down some of the most powerful people in Washington. Instead, their plane had crashed in the mountains, and the evidence had died with them, or so the conspirators had thought. "The flight plan was altered," Chen explained when David met with her again. "We've finally been able to compare the original plan filed with air traffic control to the route the plane actually took. Someone diverted Flight 447 into that storm system. Someone on the plane? Had to be. The pilot, Captain James Rodriguez, had been flying for 30 years with a perfect safety record. There's no way he would have voluntarily flown into those conditions unless someone forced him to. David felt the pieces clicking together. They were going to kill my parents anyway, but they needed to make it look like an accident. So they hijacked the plane and crashed it, killing everyone aboard to cover their tracks. The implications were staggering. 37 innocent people had died to protect a logging conspiracy. An entire plane load of passengers and crew had been murdered to keep Thomas and Margaret Harper from testifying. Armed with his mother's photographs and months of investigative work, David finally felt ready to confront the man he believed was responsible for his parents' deaths. Senator Morrison lived in a sprawling estate outside of Spokane, his wealth accumulated through decades of what was now revealed to be corruption. The interview took place in Morrison's study, surrounded by books and awards celebrating his supposed environmental advocacy. At 87, Morrison was still sharp, still projecting the authority that had made him one of the most powerful men in Washington. "I remember your parents," Morrison said when David explained why he'd come. "Tragic accident. Such a loss to the environmental movement." "It wasn't an accident," David replied, placing copies of his mother's photographs on the desk between them. "It was murder, and you ordered it." Morrison's face went pale as he looked at the images. For a moment his composure cracked, and David saw fear in the old man's eyes. But then the mask slipped back into place. "I don't know what you think these photographs prove, Mr. Harper, but they prove that you and your associates were illegally logging protected wilderness areas. They prove that my father had evidence of your crimes, and they prove that you had 37 people killed to cover it up." Morrison stood up slowly, his hands shaking slightly. "You have no proof of murder. A plane crashed in a storm 40 years ago. Tragic, but hardly unprecedented. We have proof that the flight plan was changed. We have proof that the plane was deliberately flown into the storm. And we have testimony from Robert Caldwell's secretary about your phone calls in the weeks before the crash." For the first time, Morrison looked genuinely afraid. "What do you want?" "The truth. All of it. The names of everyone involved. The full extent of the logging operations. And a confession." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want me to confess to murder? At my age? Mr. Harper, I'll be dead in a few years anyway. Why would I destroy my legacy for you?" "Because," David said quietly, 37 people died for your greed. Because you've spent 40 years being honored as an environmental hero, while you were actually one of the worst environmental criminals in American history. Because the truth deserves to come out." Morrison was quiet for a long time, staring at the photographs spread across his desk. Finally he spoke. "Your father was going to destroy everything. Not just me, not just Cascade Logging, but an entire way of life. Those logging jobs supported thousands of families. The timber industry was the backbone of the Northwest economy. So you killed him for it." "I didn't kill anyone." Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. "But I made a phone call. I told certain people that Thomas Harper was becoming a problem. I never thought they would." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Who did you call?" Morrison shook his head. "They're all dead now, all of them. I'm the last one left." But David didn't believe him. His investigation had uncovered too many connections, too many people who'd profited from the conspiracy. Someone was still alive, still covering up the truth. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While going through his parents' belongings, items that had been stored in his aunt's attic for 40 years, David found a small address book that had belonged to his father. Most of the entries were routine professional contacts, but one stood out. D. Morrison, 555-0847. D. Morrison. Not Senator Richard Morrison, but someone else with the same last name. It took David 3 days to track down the number, which had long since been disconnected. But phone company records revealed that it had belonged to Douglas Morrison, Richard Morrison's younger brother. Douglas had died in 2015, but his widow, Patricia, was still alive and living in Portland. Patricia Morrison was a small, nervous woman who clearly didn't want to talk to David. But when he showed her the photographs and explained what he'd discovered, she broke down crying. "Doug carried that guilt for 40 years, she sobbed. "He never meant for anyone to die. He was just supposed to scare your parents, make them back off. But then the plane crashed and all those people. What was your husband's role in this?" "He worked for Cascade Logging. He was the one who arranged the bribes, who falsified the environmental studies. When your father started investigating, Doug's boss told him to handle the problem. So Doug called his brother Richard, and Richard said he'd take care of it. How? Patricia looked away. There was a man Richard knew from his military days, someone who did difficult jobs. Richard gave Doug the man's number and told him to set up a meeting with your parents. The man was supposed to threaten them, maybe rough them up a little. But instead he hijacked their plane and killed everyone aboard. Patricia nodded miserably. Doug tried to find out who the man was, tried to turn him in, but Richard wouldn't tell him anything, said it was better if Doug didn't know. The guilt ate at him for the rest of his life. Do you have any records? Any evidence of your husband's involvement? Doug kept everything. He said someday the truth would come out, and he wanted to be able to prove that he never meant for anyone to die. She led David to a basement storage room filled with filing cabinets. It's all here. The contracts, the bribery records, the correspondence with Richard. Everything. The documents Patricia Morrison provided were devastating. They showed a conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of government, involving not just Senator Morrison, but officials in the Department of the Interior, the Forest Service, and even the EPA. Over the course of 2 decades, they had illegally logged over 50,000 acres of protected wilderness, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in profits while destroying irreplaceable ecosystems. But more importantly, the documents provided the name of the man who had murdered David's parents, Marcus Webb, a former Special Forces operative who had worked as a freelance assassin for hire. Webb had died in 1994, but his death had not been natural. He'd been killed in what appeared to be a professional hit, likely ordered by his former employers to ensure his silence. Armed with this evidence, David went to the FBI. The case was assigned to Special Agent Jennifer Collins, a veteran investigator who specialized in cold cases involving government corruption. The statute of limitations has run out on most of these crimes, Collins explained during their first meeting. But murder has no statute of limitations. If we can prove that Senator Morrison and his associates ordered the downing of Flight 447, we can still prosecute them. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Patricia Morrison agreed to cooperate fully, providing testimony about her husband's role in the conspiracy. Several other elderly participants came forward, their guilt finally overwhelming their fear. And the physical evidence from the crash site, combined with Margaret Harper's photographs, painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. Senator Richard Morrison was arrested at his home on a rainy morning in November, 41 years after Flight 447 disappeared into the Cascade Mountains. The charges included conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and bribery. At 87, he would likely die in prison. But for David, the arrest was only part of the justice he sought. The larger goal was ensuring that the truth about the logging conspiracy became public, that the environmental damage was acknowledged, and that the victims of Flight 447 were finally remembered for what they really were. Not accident victims, but murder victims who had died trying to protect the wilderness they loved. The story David wrote for the Seattle Herald ran on the front page under the headline, "Conspiracy of Silence: How a Senator Ordered the Murder of 37 People to Hide Environmental Crimes." The article was picked up by newspapers across the country and led to congressional hearings on government corruption and environmental crime. But perhaps more importantly, it led to the establishment of the Thomas and Margaret Harper Memorial Forest, a protected wilderness area in the Cascades where logging was permanently banned. The forest encompassed much of the land that David's parents had died trying to protect, ensuring that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The camera that had preserved their final photographs was donated to the Smithsonian Institution, where it became part of an exhibit on investigative journalism and environmental protection. Visitors could see the actual images that Margaret Harper had taken in her final days, documenting the conspiracy that would cost her life. On the first anniversary of the forest's designation, David stood at the memorial marker that had been erected at the site where Flight 447 had crashed. The names of all 37 victims were engraved on a granite wall, with a special inscription for his parents, Thomas and Margaret Harper. They died protecting this wilderness so that future generations could enjoy it. David's daughter Sarah, now a photographer herself, stood beside him with her own camera, documenting the ceremony for the environmental magazine where she worked. Like her grandmother, she believed in the power of images to tell truth and inspire action. "Do you think they know?" Sarah asked quietly. "Do you think Grandma and Grandpa know that their story finally came out?" David looked up at the towering trees that his parents had died to protect. trees that would now stand forever thanks to their sacrifice. Somewhere in those trees, a bird was singing. The same kind of bird his mother had photographed countless times. The same wilderness sounds that had inspired her work. "I think they know," he said. "I think they've known all along that someday the truth would come out. They just had to wait for the right moment, for the right person to find their camera and tell their story." As they walked back down the mountain trail, David thought about the strange providence that had brought his mother's photographs to light after 40 years. Climate change had revealed the crash site, but it had taken human persistence and the refusal to accept easy answers to uncover the truth behind the tragedy. His parents had been silenced by violence and corruption, but their voices had not been stilled. Through the photographs Margaret had taken and the evidence Thomas had gathered, they had continued speaking across the decades, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to care enough to seek justice. The camera had remembered what people had tried to forget, and in remembering, it had finally set the truth free. David Harper had spent 40 years wondering what had happened to his parents. Now he knew. They had died as they had lived, fighting for what they believed in, protecting the wilderness they loved, and refusing to be silenced by those who put profit above principle. The camera that had captured their final days had also captured their legacy, a commitment to truth, a love of the natural world, and a belief that some things were worth dying for. That legacy lived on in the protected forest that bore their name, in the journalists who continued their work, and in the daughter and granddaughter who carried their passion for justice into the next generation. 40 years after Flight 447 disappeared into the mountains, Thomas and Margaret Harper had finally come home. Not their bodies, those had been laid to rest years ago, but their story, their truth, and their vindication. The camera had remembered everything, and in remembering had ensured that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. In the end, that was all any of them could ask for, to be remembered not as victims, but as people who had stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. The wilderness they had died to protect would stand as their monument, and the truth they had uncovered would serve as their epitaph. The camera that remembered had finally told its story, and the mountains themselves seemed to sigh with relief that the long silence had finally been broken. In the months that followed the Memorial Forest dedication, David found himself drawn repeatedly back to the mountains. Sometimes he came alone, sometimes with Sarah, and occasionally with his granddaughter Emma, who at 12 was already showing signs of inheriting the family's passion for environmental protection. Each visit to the crash site brought new revelations, not about the conspiracy that had killed his parents, but about the healing power of truth finally told. The Thomas and Margaret Harper Memorial Forest had become more than just a protected wilderness area. It had evolved into a symbol of resistance against corruption, a testament to the idea that truth could not be buried forever, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against it. Environmental groups from across the country made pilgrimages to the forest, drawing inspiration from the story of two people who had died rather than abandon their principles. But the impact of David's investigation extended far beyond symbolic gestures. The congressional hearings triggered by his reporting had led to a comprehensive review of federal environmental policies, revealing a pattern of corruption that stretched back decades. Over 30 current and former officials faced charges ranging from bribery to conspiracy, and environmental regulations were strengthened to prevent future abuses. The Cascade Logging Company, once one of the largest timber operations in the Pacific Northwest, had been forced into bankruptcy by the criminal charges and civil lawsuits that followed the investigation. Their former logging sites were being restored to their natural state, with native species replanted and damaged watersheds repaired. It would take generations for the ecosystem to fully recover, but the healing had begun. Senator Morrison's trial had become a media sensation, not just because of the shocking nature of the crimes, but because of the man's complete lack of remorse. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence of his guilt, Morrison maintained that he had been protecting the economic interests of his constituents, that environmental regulations were obstacles to prosperity that needed to be circumvented. "I regret the loss of life," Morrison had said during his final statement before sentencing, "but I don't regret trying to bring jobs and economic opportunity to the Pacific Northwest." Those trees were a renewable resource that could have supported thousands of families for generations. The judge, a Reagan appointee who had spent 40 years on the federal bench, had been unimpressed by Morrison's justifications. "Senator Morrison," Judge Catherine Walsh had said, "you have corrupted every office you've held and betrayed every trust placed in you. You ordered the murder of 37 innocent people to protect your illegal profits. No economic justification can excuse such evil." Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 87, it was effectively a death sentence. But David found little satisfaction in the old man's fate. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back the victims of Flight 447 or undo 4 decades of environmental destruction. The real victory lay in the changes that his parents' story had inspired. Environmental journalism had experienced a renaissance, with news organizations dedicating more resources to investigating government-corporate collusion. Whistleblower protections had been strengthened, making it safer for government employees to report corruption. And new laws required that all environmental impact studies be conducted by independent scientists, not by companies with financial interests in the outcomes. David's own career had taken an unexpected turn. The success of his investigation had led to offers from major newspapers and television networks, but he had turned them all down. Instead, he had accepted a position at the University of Washington, where he taught investigative journalism and helped train the next generation of environmental reporters. "Your grandmother understood something that took me 40 years to learn," he told his students during a lecture about the Harper case. "She understood that journalism isn't just about reporting facts. It's about bearing witness to truth, even when that truth is dangerous to tell." He would often bring Margaret's camera to class, the same Nikon that had captured the final evidence of the logging conspiracy. The camera had been restored to working condition and donated to the journalism school, where students could handle the actual equipment that had helped expose one of the biggest environmental crimes in American history. "This camera sat at the bottom of a mountain for 40 years, David would tell them, but the truth it contained was patient. It waited for the right moment, the right person, the right circumstances to reveal what it knew. That's what real journalism does. It preserves truth until the world is ready to hear it." Sarah Harper Chen, who had taken her husband's name but kept her family's passion for justice, had followed in her grandmother's footsteps in more ways than one. Her photographs documenting the restoration of the former Cascade logging sites had won a Pulitzer Prize, and her book, Recovered Wilderness: The Return of the Thomas and Margaret Harper Memorial Forest, had become a bestseller. But more importantly, she had taken up the family tradition of using photography to expose environmental crimes. Her work had helped shut down illegal mining operations in Alaska, revealed toxic dumping in Native American communities, and documented the effects of climate change on vulnerable ecosystems around the world. "I feel like I'm carrying on a conversation that my grandmother started," Sarah had told an interviewer. "Every photograph I take is part of the same story she was telling, that the natural world is worth protecting, that corruption and greed will always try to destroy what's beautiful and pure, but that truth has a way of surfacing when we least expect it." Emma Harper Chen, now 15 and already an accomplished photographer in her own right, represented the third generation of the family legacy. Her Instagram account, A Wilderness Truth, had over 1 million followers who looked to her for updates on environmental issues and restoration projects. But unlike her mother and great-grandmother, Emma had grown up in the digital age, where truth could spread instantly around the world, but where lies could spread just as quickly. Great-grandma Margaret had to wait 40 years for her truth to come out. Emma had written in a school essay about her family's history. But today, we can share truth in real time. That's both a blessing and a curse. It means we can expose corruption faster than ever before, but it also means that corrupt people can spread misinformation to discredit us faster than ever before, too. The essay had gone viral when Sarah shared it online, sparking discussions about the role of social media in environmental activism and the challenges facing young people who wanted to make a difference in an increasingly polarized world. David had been particularly moved by his granddaughter's conclusion. "I think the most important thing my great-grandparents taught us is that truth doesn't belong to any one person or any one generation. It's like a river that flows through time, sometimes underground where we can't see it, but always moving toward the light. Our job isn't to own the truth or control it. Our job is to help it flow." On the 5th anniversary of the Memorial Forest's dedication, the Harper family organized a symposium on environmental journalism and government accountability. Speakers included former EPA administrators, investigative reporters who had covered environmental crimes, and activists who had been inspired by Margaret and Thomas Harper's story. But the most powerful speaker was Patricia Morrison, Douglas Morrison's widow, who had become an unlikely advocate for environmental protection in her final years. "My husband spent 40 years consumed by guilt over his role in the Harper murders," she told the audience. "He never forgave himself for making that phone call, for setting in motion the events that led to 37 deaths. But in his final years, he found some peace by dedicating himself to environmental causes, trying to make amends for the damage he had helped cause." Patricia had donated all of her husband's records to the Harper Memorial Archive at the University of Washington, creating a comprehensive record of the logging conspiracy that researchers could study for generations to come. She had also established a scholarship fund for students studying environmental journalism, ensuring that future reporters would have the resources they needed to investigate corporate malfeasance. "Doug used to say that the dead don't stay buried if their stories need to be told," Patricia continued. "Margaret and Thomas Harper couldn't rest until their truth came out, and now that it has, their work continues through all of you who are carrying on their mission." The symposium concluded with a ceremony at the crash site, where a new element had been added to the memorial: a bronze sculpture of a camera, positioned to look out over the forest that the Harpers had died to protect. The inscription read, "In memory of all who bear witness to truth, especially when that truth is dangerous to tell." As David stood before the sculpture with his family, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. For 40 years, he had lived with unanswered questions about his parents' death. The discovery of his mother's camera had not just provided answers, it had revealed a larger truth about the corruption that threatened the natural world his parents had loved. But perhaps most importantly, it had shown him that death was not the end of the story for people who lived their lives in service of something greater than themselves. Margaret and Thomas Harper had died in 1983, but their influence had grown stronger with each passing year. Their photographs, their evidence, their example had inspired countless others to take up the cause of environmental protection. "Do you think they would be proud of what we've accomplished?" Sarah asked as they prepared to leave the memorial site. David looked out over the forest, where ancient trees now grew where clear cuts had once scarred the landscape. Eagles soared overhead, their cries echoing off the mountain peaks. A stream bubbled nearby, its water clear and cold, carrying life to the valleys below. "I think they would be amazed," he said, "not just by what we've accomplished, but by how their story has continued to grow and change, inspiring people they never could have imagined reaching." Emma was already documenting the ceremony with her own camera, a digital device that could instantly share images with millions of people around the world. But in many ways, she was doing exactly what her great-grandmother had done 42 years earlier, bearing witness to truth, creating a record of what she saw, trusting that her images would someday make a difference. "The thing about truth," David told his granddaughter as they walked back down the mountain trail, "is that it doesn't always come out right away. Sometimes it takes decades, sometimes it takes generations, but it always comes out eventually, because there are always people like your great-grandmother who refuse to let it stay buried." Emma nodded thoughtfully, adjusting her camera settings to capture the late afternoon light filtering through the forest canopy. "So our job is to keep documenting, keep investigating, keep asking questions, even if we don't live to see the answers?" "Exactly. We plant seeds of truth that others will harvest. We start conversations that future generations will finish. We bear witness to what we see, trusting that someday, someone will need that witness to set things right." As they reached the trailhead, David turned for one last look at the mountain where his parents had died. The crash site was no longer visible from this distance, hidden among the trees that had reclaimed the forest, but he could feel their presence in the wind that moved through the branches, in the sound of water flowing over stone, in the knowledge that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The camera that had preserved their final truth now rested in a place of honor at the University of Washington, still capable of taking photographs, still ready to bear witness to whatever truths might need preserving. Students handled it with reverence, understanding that they were touching an instrument that had helped change the world. But the real legacy of Margaret and Thomas Harper lived not in the camera itself, but in the countless other cameras, notebooks, and recording devices carried by journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by their story. Each new investigation into environmental crime, each photograph documenting corporate malfeasance, each whistleblower willing to risk their career to expose corruption, All of these were part of the continuing story that Margaret Harper had begun when she secretly photographed those documents in the final days of her life. The truth had been patient for 40 years, waiting in the snow and ice of the Cascade Mountains for someone to find it and set it free. Now that it was free, it continued to grow and spread, creating new truths, inspiring new investigations, and ensuring that the powerful could never again silence those who threatened to expose their crimes. David Harper had spent his adult life as a journalist, but his parents' story had taught him that journalism was more than just a profession. It was a sacred trust, a commitment to bear witness to truth regardless of the personal cost. That trust would pass to his daughter and to his granddaughter, and to all the others who understood that in a world where lies could travel at the speed of light, someone still needed to be willing to wait 40 years for the truth to emerge from the mountains where it had been buried. The camera remembered everything. And as long as there were people willing to look through its lens and see what it saw, the truth would continue to flow like water through time, sometimes underground, sometimes in the light, but always moving toward the moment when justice would finally be served.